Welcome to the MAM journals. They launched this 1300 on the 28th of September 2023. My first GS was in 2006 and it was the R1200. Since that time, they've evolved over time and brought out the 1250 and various derivatives of that. They've sold hundreds of thousands of them, and I think that's a testimony to how good the bikes are. It is the best-selling large adventure bike in the world. Every time they bring out changes, you get a tsunami of comments. Things like, it's too big, it's not big enough, it's got too much technology on, it's not got enough technology on, and my personal favourite, I don't like the headlamps, but this is probably the most significant change they've made, certainly in the last 20 years. This channel is designed to, well, as well as to keeping me out of garden centres, to provide objective and fair reviews. And what I'll be doing is, obviously, naturally comparing this 1300 to my 1250. I may even have the audacity to get off the fence at the end and come to a conclusion as to which bike I prefer. What we're going to do today is I'll go through the specifications. I won't be exhaustive in that because it would take too long because there's such a huge amount of technology on the bike, but I do hope to give you a flavour of what it's got and what they've improved. We'll then be going for a ride, which will be a traditional British spring, so that's rain then, and I'll then come back, give you my concluding thoughts and comments, and I will get off the fence. I hope that you enjoy the video. I normally start with the engine, and I'll get to that in a minute, but what I think will be useful if I just tell you what this bike is and its equipment levels. BMW have a system whereby you pick packs which make up the overall specification of the bike. This is an R1300GS TE, and for those of you in the UK, I'm going to give you the prices as well. The base bike is £17,830. Now, the bike is in racing blue metallic and it's got what's called a trophy pack on it, which is £830. It's got something called adaptive vehicle height control, which is £490. It's got the Enduro Package Pro, which is £600. It's got seat heating, which is £150, and don't laugh. And it's got a top case carrier on it, which is £220. It's also fitted with what's called the Comfort Package, which is £480, and it's got the gold cross-spoke wheels, which are £50 for an upgrade. The bike's also fitted with LED additional front fogs. The total price of this bike is £21,675. I'll come back to that at the end. The bike is fitted with a brand new engine. It's a 1300cc, it's a boxer twin, and it's fitted with double overhead cams. This bike is fitted with what's called the shift cam system. It's air and liquid cooled, and it produces 145 horsepower at 7,750 and 149 newton meters at 6.5. Just to give you a comparison with the R1250, which it replaces, that produced 134 horsepower at 7,750 and 143 newton meters at 6,250, so 250 revs less. The bike's also fitted with a new gearbox, which is underneath. So going to the front of the bike, it's fitted with a 19-inch wheel and a 3-inch rim, and the tyres on it are their 120/70s, and actually that's the same as the 1250. I think those wheels are actually the same, but somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, I've no doubt. It's got a twin disc on it with 310mm discs, and it's semi-floating. It's got a 4-piston radial caliper, and the bike is fitted with lean sensitive ABS, so obviously it's got an IMU in there. The steering head angle is 63.8, and that gives you a rake of 26.2, so in comparison to the 1250, that's slightly more in terms of rake because the the 1250 is 25.7. Obviously, the GS is famous for having a telelever system, which basically means your steering department is separate from your bouncing department, which gives it characteristics which I'll talk a bit about when we go for a ride. On the brakes, while we're talking about it, because I don't mention when we go for a ride, in terms of comparisons, these brakes are better or more responsive than the 1250 brakes, and I'm sure that some people would prefer that. It's definitely got more bite to it and less pull on the lever than, as I say, its predecessor. I like these. I think they're a nice and useful addition. Anything that helps you get seen is probably a good idea. At the rear of the bike, it's fitted with a 17-inch wheel with a 4.5 rim. That's 170/60 R17s, the tyres, which are the same as the 1250. It's got a single 285mm disc on it with 2-piston floating calipers. It's a single-sided cast aluminium swing arm, which apparently is fitted with transversal connected swing arm bearings, whatever they are when they're home. In terms of suspension, the GSs have had, indeed a lot of the BMW range have had quite sophisticated suspension for some time, and it is electronic. Now, part of the development of this bike is they've gone one step further, and they describe it as combining the dynamic adjustment of the front and rear damping with a corresponding adjustment of the spring rate, spring stiffness, depending on the selected riding mode, riding condition and manoeuvres. So clearly I'm looking forward to riding it and finding out what that means on the road. Standing back and getting a broader look at the bike, you can see immediately that it's got this die-cast aluminium frame. Now that is significantly different from the previous model, which had traditional tubing on it, and whether you like the look of it or not, we'll talk about aesthetics in a moment. The bike has a 19-litre usable tank volume, which is, if you think in imperial gallons, 4.18 gallons. The bike weighs 237 kilos wet, i.e. usable, and that versus 249 of my bike, so that's down 12 kilograms, or if you think in pounds, 26 pounds, so it's a lighter bike. The wheelbase, i.e. the point from the wheel contact to the wheel contact, is 1.518 metres, so tiny bit longer, and as I just touched on earlier, the rake is slightly different as well, so whether or not those differences are enough for most of us to feel remains to be seen, but again I'll give you some comments when I'm out riding. The standard seat height on this bike is 850mm, and this bike is fitted with adaptive vehicle height control, which I talked about when we went through the specs. Now, with adaptive vehicle height control, it offers fully automatic adjustment of the vehicle height depending on the operating condition, thereby ensuring the greatest possible comfort. And as somebody who is vertically challenged, that was of particular interest to me, and I will talk about that when we go for a ride. I think we should take the time, as it's such a different bike, we should talk about aesthetics and finish. The bike overall is obviously significantly slimmer. It's more, I suspect BMW are going to hate this word, more supermoto in terms of how that bench seat looks. The X lights at the front there have certainly created plenty of comment. Some people like them, some people don't. And this sort of black-grey engine and wheels, actually I think one of the things I love about my GS 1250 is it's a good bike to ride. One of the things I don't like about it is it's an absolute nightmare to clean. So I was very interested to see what it was like having ridden this bike in some pretty mucky conditions. Anyone think it's spring in Britain? And got it pretty dirty. This bike, definitely with this new finish, feels easier to clean, and things like bigger gaps on the fins just make it a bit easier to get at, which for me, I know not everybody worries about how their bikes look, but I'm sort of the worst of both worlds. I like riding them in all weathers, but I like them to look really clean. So how easy a bike is to clean is for me an important thing. The BMW tend to have what I call, certainly on these GS models, a textured finish. For example, on these wheels, these are the same as the last ones. These can be quite difficult to clean, but these gold ones came up much better than my black ones, which never really have ever looked black again. They look more like muddy brown, which I find a little frustrating. The bike is better to clean. Personally, I like the aesthetics of the bike. I think it's slimmed down, and I think it feels more modern. But again, looks, I always accept, looks are very subjective, and it's a question whether it, to your eye, you like it or not. One thing I particularly like about it, I like the way that this like blends in, because there's a big gap on my 1250, which I think is a bit unsightly. And again, when you're riding the bike, you're more on it than in it, and that for me is a good thing. Okay, so let's have a look at the technology that's enabled at the front through the dash and the various buttons and controls. It is different but familiar. So if you're an existing BMW owner, a lot of the buttons you'll sort of recognise. Slight differences, of course, because it's got more technology on it, so it means you end up with slightly more buttons so you can access it. The old GS, you used to start with a button in the middle there. That is now fitted over here. So if I activate the system, you can see it becomes alive. Now, that's your standard TFT screen, works very well, and you can combine your sat-nav systems with it as well, whether you use either a sat-nav or I use a mobile phone when I went out, and you'll see it in most of the video shots because of the camera angle. That's what you see, and it works really well. I think the BMW TFT and navigation combination is probably one of the best that I've experienced. So credit where credit is due. It's easier to swap between what you're looking on here and adjusting on that one. You can see there it says TFT, so obviously that means that the controls are based on that. But if I just press the menu button, it's then gone to navigation, so that you can cursor your maps in and out, zooming in and out, changing what you're doing and if it sounds complicated, it isn't, because I always work on the principle, well, I can do it, it can't be that complicated. But it is a little, like most of these systems, takes a little while to adjust to them. Now, the biggest difference I found on this is, of course, because it's got more functionality, they need to give you a way of getting in and then changing systems on the screen, because they've run out of space for buttons. So what you do is you go to the menu here, this button, press that, and you're into the options that you've got and the controls on the various things that you need. I said that this got a heated seats, and unlike my GS, the heated grips are not controlled from here. They're controlled by going into the menu. Some people don't like that. They like to have instant access to it, but it is genuinely easy to do it. And as you can see, you've got the whirly wheel on here, which you can then cursor down to the thing that you're wanting to do. And you have got quite a lot of flexibility on it. Damping, by the way, I won't go through each of the menus on it, but just to tell you what you can do. The bike is very sophisticated in terms of what we're doing, as we touched on earlier when talking through what suspension does and the fact it changes the spring rate as well. But you've also got individual adjustments in each of the modes that you can set up for yourself. I think it goes plus or -2 in each of those areas, so you really can fine tune it to how you want your damping and ride to feel. It's a good system. I'll just show the windscreen there, just pressed across. You can see it's got up, and then you go to the rocker button, and you can see up and down. I do actually use it on the go, and you may well notice that during the course of the ride. I'll go to heating, because obviously it's got heated seats, and you can see I can adjust the levels there on both the seat and the grips. You don't have to have them the same. Nice and flexible, easy to use. So slightly more complexity to it, but I certainly found it, as I say, very straightforward. Cruise control is on the bike as part of this particular bundle of packages, and I operate that when we're out and about. Easy to do, just turn it on. I'll just come back to the main menu. Back to that, you can turn the system on, and then you set the speed that you want by pressing it forward, and then single dabs on it will actually increase the speed in increments to what you want to do. Again, very intuitive. You don't once you've got used to the system, you don't actually have to look, take your eyes off the road. You can do it as you go. So works really well. I think BMW have always been good at these dash and control arrangements, and not surprisingly, I think this one is slightly better and has slightly more sophistication to it. One thing I'd like to show you whilst we're have a good camera picture of it is this symbol here, which is actually telling you about the height adaptive control system. So that's telling you whether it's in the low or the high position. I talk about that again when we go for a ride, but it's probably going to be too small for you to actually see it on the GoPro footage. But without spoiling the party, it's a great system. Before we sort of leave up here, some of you, the more observant, may have noticed a little pack here. Nice touch for a mobile phone, which of us hasn't got one nowadays, and nice, easy, secure place to keep it. I've gone through the specifications, not a huge amount of depth, but just to give you a flavour for what it's got and how it does it. But if you want to know more detail, I would recommend that you go to the BMW website, have a look through, and it tells you, for example, what every pack consists of and what you get in the overall package. And it also goes through more detail on the specifications. It's a very sophisticated bike. It's got a lot on it. Of course, with motorbikes, the best thing is riding them. So let's go for a ride. I've been really looking forward to riding the new GS since its launch. North Oxford BMW, who've kindly lent me this bike, offered me a test ride immediately, but understandably didn't want the bike away for 3 days it takes us to ride, photograph and film the videos. If ever there was a bike that deserves a careful and considered review, it's the new GS. It does, after all, form the mainstay of BMW's motorcycle sales. I use my GS for longer, often 2-up journeys, fully laden, and often on roads I don't know. I suspect many others are the same. I therefore decided to take the bike on a 170-mile loop down to and round the Forest of Dean. The trip has a variety of roads, and the distance replicates the 170 to 250 miles a day we do when touring. I do know that others do more, but we find that, for us, works. I am an all-year rider, so rain features regularly in my journeys. Waking to sunshine, I was hopeful for a dry, if slightly cool ride. Slinging my leg over the bike, the clouds opened and the temperature dropped to 4 degrees. The joys of spring in Britain. Whilst I would have preferred some nice dry roads, I wasn't actually overly bothered. The GS is a bike I do ride in all weathers, and it was good to have the direct comparison with this new 1300. I started filming on the road between Gloucester and Chepstow. It's a nice flowing road, which probably explains why it is festooned with speed cameras. I like to get an initial feel for the engine modes, how they work with the gearbox, the brakes, a general feel for the suspension, and how easy the control systems, ever more sophisticated, are to operate on the go. I rode the bike in rain, road and dynamic mode. As discussed in the specification review, the modes alter both the way the power is delivered and the suspension settings, with rain mode delivering both the softest power delivery and the softest suspension.
Like many riders, I prefer softer suspension in the wet, although I am less bothered about power delivery, as unless the throttle is like an on-off switch, you can moderate that yourself. Feel free to call me old-fashioned. The new GS does have a lot of torque, but the throttle is smooth and linear in all modes. The bike is pretty restrained in rain mode, but some might prefer it for low grip riding. Road, as you would expect, is somewhere between rain and dynamic, and certainly felt okay in the occasionally very wet conditions that I encountered. Dynamic, as the name implies, is the most energetic of the modes, and in normal conditions the one I would use the most, occasionally dropping to road on longer dual carriageways runs to give a slightly plusher ride. I was particularly interested to explore how the new gearbox, a completely new design, functions. I've owned both an R1200GS, the gearbox of which I just described as agricultural, and still own an R1250GS, whose gearbox has graduated to industrial. The new gearbox remains clunky compared to other bikes and engine configurations out there, but I did find it better than my current bike. The gear shift assist has always worked reasonably well going up, but certainly the older model is less helpful going down. I did find the new gearbox more cooperative, which is good. I actually deliberately rode in lower gears than I normally would to thoroughly test the gearbox and those settings. The settings on, I will now call it quick shifter for ease, are well matched for each mode. For me, this is a good step forward. It is not perfect, but it is definitely improved. I'll actually come back to make a comment on gearing later. The new engine produces more power and more torque. Can you feel it on the road? Well, definitely yes. Off camera, I'm not sure if the batteries were flat or flooded, I rode a little more, I shall say, enthusiastically. You do notice the difference. The torque is more impressive than the power, which in my opinion is one of the key characteristics of a GS. Whether or not some traditional GS riders feel the need for more power remains to be seen, but I certainly enjoyed it. It is not a sports bike, but for an adventure tourer, boy does it go. The engine is mechanically noisy, more so than its predecessor, and the exhaust note is different. Not necessarily better nor worse, but definitely different. I didn't mind it. Both bikes sound better to my ear in dynamic mode. The chassis and suspension are all new as well. GS's with their telelever front end have always handled differently to most other bikes. The new GS, whilst retaining the anti-dive benefits of the telelever system, feels more conventional in its handling, and I found the tipping points and transitions smoother and more predictable. I think it handles better than my low chassis 1250. Anyone who owns a GS will know what I mean when I say you do get the occasional clunk, clatter and scuttle. Alarming to newcomers, once you realise the rear shock isn't about to drop off, or indeed has dropped off, you soon accept it. It is part of the design character of the bike. The new one still feels like a GS, but it is, how shall I say, less vocal in its endeavours. Slow speed handling and steering feels different to my bike, but take that as an observation rather than a criticism. I'm pretty sure the slightly different riding and bar position lie at the heart of this. Familiarisation is the key. Talking of slow speeds and returning to gearing, I did actually try both second and third gear for the increasingly frequent 20 mile an hour limits. The audio on the GoPro makes third sound more laboured than it actually did while I was riding the bike. I think it's okay in either. This is Tinton, by the way. It's a small village in the Wye Valley in Monmouthshire, famous for its abbey, although it was a ford in Roman times. The Abbey was founded by Walter de Clare, who sounds like a Norman to me, in 1131. One of my favourite bits of road on this loop is between Tynton and Monmouth, and I had hoped to press on a little. Ever increasing speed cameras and regular changes in limits tempered that plan a little, but I was still hopeful of the last section. The weather, of course, had different plans. The temperature dropped 3 degrees and I was treated to a hailstorm that left some parts of the road white with hailstones. But never mind, it was still fun. And I stopped my usual view up the valley. It is a beautiful, if now slightly slower, part of the world. I wanted to test the bike on the sort of roads we use to make up distance when we tour, and the dual carriageway from Monmouth was perfect. The cruise control is easy to operate, and in this section I set it for both 50 and 70 miles per hour. I raised the electric screen to high, turned up the heated seat and grips, and relaxed. At 70 miles an hour, the bike is pulling a sedate and comfortable 4,000 revs and delivers about 55 miles to the imperial gallon. The tank gives a range of about 220 miles. The warning light comes on at about 50 miles, so for most of us, we have plenty of time to find fuel. This bike remains a mile eater, and for me, it's actually significantly more comfortable than my existing bike. I suspect there are a number of things contributing to this. The electric screen, the heated grips and seats certainly protected me from the elements. I ride enough miles in the winter to know that being what I would describe as core cold is uncomfortable. I will tolerate as many real men don't need heated seats jibes as you like if I'm going to keep warm in freezing rain. I know a lot of winter riders use heated clothing, and I can see why. It adds significantly to comfort and enjoyment. The other significant contributor to my comfort was the adaptive vehicle height control. An 850mm seat height is fine whilst on the go. At slower speeds, 2 up, fully laden, it is too tall for me, particularly at junctions with an adverse camber. It's actually why I bought a low chassis model. I need 820mm to have enough contact to feel secure and hold the weight. The adaptive height control system does exactly that. At about 30 miles per hour, it raises to 850, giving a comfortable riding position, and at 15 miles per hour, it drops to 820, giving me control. For me, the system is perfect. It's a revelation. Technology that delivers what I want. The BMW TFT screen is well known for its clarity and ease of use. It combines well with the BMW app and phone holder, and you can move easily between TFT and navigation control systems. It makes for easy touring. After 176 miles in pretty poor conditions, the camera footage makes it look better than it actually was. I arrived home as fresh as a daisy. That, for me, is what an adventure tourer should do.
Well, that was fun. Before I come to my conclusions, the R1250 is a phenomenal bike. The reason why, as I touched on at the introduction, they've sold hundreds of thousands of them is because it is so good. When I bought my 1250, I thought it was a great bike, and I still think it's a great bike today. But when I compare it to the new 1300, and these are personal opinions, this bike, it goes better, it stops better, it handles better, it's more comfortable, I prefer the aesthetics of the bike, and it's a lot easier to clean. It's hard not to come to the conclusion that if the R1250 is a great bike, and it is, the 1300 is a brilliant bike. It's not perfect. There are a couple of things I personally don't like with it. I find that the engine is a bit clattery, and going back to when we went through the specifications, it's an awful lot of money. This is an expensive bike. But overall, I've got a horrible feeling that when I'm riding my 1250, deep down I'll be wishing I was on the 1300, but isn't that often the way? I do hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that you found it useful and constructive. If you did, you might be kind enough to press like or consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't. But as is always the case, what is most important is that you ride safe and that you stay well.